now, from the great state of Mississauga in Ontario, Canada, it's the Ted Woloshyn Podcast. Brought to you by ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. ETP Canada. And Tom's Place, for the finest in men's fashion. Tom's Place will suit you. And now, here's Ted.
Welcome once again, and thank you all for taking the time to join us on this week's podcast. And my special guest this week is the possessor of many, many talents. He is a musician, composer, scorer of television and film projects, and currently the author of a fabulous book titled Unplugged: Secrets and Stories from a Life Making Records, Scoring Film, and Working with the Legends of Music. Fred Mollin's film and television credits include the television film Spring Fever, Amy Fisher, My Story, the television series Beverly Hills 90210, The Outer Limits, Friday the 13th, and my personal favorite, which we'll get to a little later, CBC Television's It's Only Rock and Roll. The list of musicians that he has worked with in his career would eat up most of this time that we've allotted for this podcast, so I've cut down, and I'll just give you a few names. They include Billy Joel, Willie Nelson, Carly Simon, Linda Ronstadt, Johnny Mathis, Danny Hill, or Dan Hill, Joe Cocker, Michael McDonald, Bryan Adams, David Crosby, and the band America. He's also written and produced Disney's Lullaby album, which your kids and you will love, trust me. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my friend and hopefully one day yours, Fred Mollin. Hello, Freddie. Good to see you, my friend. I got to tell you, it's a wonderful book. It really is. And what I really like about it, I felt as though I was sitting on the couch and you were across from me telling me stories, right? While I was sipping a drink of cheap wine or smoking yesterday's joint. I'm not sure. But anyway, it's a very conversational, fascinating stories, man. I mean, just wow, what a life. Good for you.
Thank you.
How long did it take you to write?
Well, I'd love to tell you that it was really fast. It wasn't. It was, I started writing the book probably 5 or 6 years ago, where I started to dictate into my phone certain stories that I didn't want to forget them. So I would dictate them into the phone, and then I'd play with them later and edit them and polish them up. And when I had about 20 of them, that's when I said, I bet I could write a book, because I never really thought I would. And then I started to do this, and it sort of never ended. So I kept dictating stories into the phone, kept on editing them. And then really about 2 years ago, I got very serious about it. In the past year, I really got serious about it and spent a lot of time writing it and rewriting it and et cetera. Yeah.
It's hard sometimes when you think back when your career started back in the 70s, right? It's difficult to remember things back 50, 60 years ago. And I guess the worst, almost a curse would be, is if you write a story about someone, you recall the story, and that person says, no, it didn't happen that way. But meanwhile, it's already been published. Has that happened? Anybody read your book and said, it's not really right, Fred?
The book's only been out for a couple of weeks, so I'm sort of waiting for that, but only for a few instances. I'm not so sure it will happen a lot. I think it may happen a couple of times, but my memory's really sharp as far as the stories I put in the book. And I don't think, like, I definitely also, I'd run things by certain people too. I say, is this the way it happened? And
right.
And 8 times out of 10 they said yeah. And the other times I'd fix it. But there may be some that people will come after me and say, that's not what happened.
Right. Yeah, one of the early quotes in your book that stuck with me, and you say, "There's music going through my head continuously during my waking hours, like a jukebox on free play," which made me laugh. And I thought, wow, what a great picture you painted. And I thought, was that true even as a young kid growing up in Amityville before you moved to America, Long Island?
I think so. I mean, that's something I can't tell you because I don't remember my earliest years as far as my inner psychology and so on. But certainly since I was an adult, the music doesn't stop playing in my head. When I go to bed, I'm still hearing it. When I wake up, I hear it. And it could be anything. It could be something. Generally, it's something I'm working on. And then, it's just because I'm in the studio, we're repeating things so many times and listening to it so many times that, it just becomes hypnotic. And I start to hear it in the other parts of my day. But there's also times when just out of nowhere I'll be listening in my head, and it'll be something I remember when I was 10. Some
Hmm.
song I loved when I was 10 or something.
Yeah. You, like a lot of musicians, or maybe that's not a fair assumption, but like many musicians that I've spoken with, school was not a big thing for you, other than the part of school that involved music. And in your case, it was junior high playing snare drum in the school band, and that was what kind of kept you in school up until you hit 16, right?
Yeah, I sort of loved eighth and ninth grade because we had a really good school band, and I was the drummer, and I loved our teacher, Barry Bieber. His name is. I think he's still around, and he was just one of those great sort of Mr. Holland's Opus sort of teachers, where he just really became such a pal of all these kids. And it was during a very rough time because the Vietnam War was really going, and
Right.
there was a lot of reason to not feel like you'd be part of the gang. But we were part of a very hip little contingent in our junior high school, and then so that did keep me there. And then when I moved to another school in 10th grade, a lot of my friends that I had made over those years in seventh, eighth, and ninth grade were in a different part of America, and they went to a different school,
Right.
and I was in sort of a shittier school,
Yeah.
and not just a bad neighborhood. I hate to say this, a less um, a less successful neighborhood high school, and I
Okay.
didn't have any friends. And it wasn't about the money; it was just all my friends were in the other school, and so that didn't help. And then by then I was like, please let me out of this prison. I want to make music. I want to make a living making music. At that point, I wanted to be a singer songwriter. I wanted to be the next James Taylor or whatever, and
Right.
um, I just couldn't wait to leave. So I quit when I was 16.
Well, and that's a great story too, because literally on your 16th birthday, you marched down to your school with your mom in tow, or you in tow, or whichever way you want to look at it, and you sign a form saying, "Hey, I quit." I didn't even know such a thing existed, but I guess it does.
Well, you could only do it when you were 16, but literally the day I turned 16, my mom and I walked to the high school and I signed this thing, and it was my first day of real freedom.
How difficult was it to convince either of your parents? My birthday's coming up. Guess what I'm getting for my 16th? Freedom. You know what I
Ted,
mean?
they saw it coming. They really did.
Yeah.
It was not a surprise. My mom was a real enabler. My father was someone who just understood enough that he was okay with it, and but they really saw it coming. And I was the last one. I was the third kid, and the baby. So I think they were also good and tired. So they probably were thrilled that I might be leaving the nest soon.
Yeah.
But I didn't surprise them. I mean, I had always been so obviously a creative kid and so obviously involved in music. But let me tell you that in the part of Long Island that I grew up in, it was an affluent area. We were sort of middle class. We were not upper class. We were middle
Mm.
class Long Island Jews. And I have to tell you that in 1969, when I turned 16, it really was odd that someone like me would have quit school. And I literally remember, Ted, I have an absolute memory that soon after I quit school, I was outside of our house in Long Island in Merrick, and my mom was talking to a neighbor. And I must have been near the car, but I wasn't like right next to them, but I could hear them talking. And the neighbor was saying to my mother, "I'm so sorry about Fred." And it was like I was dead, or maybe had joined the circus or
Yeah,
something,
yeah, yeah,
because the truth is, I was the happiest person ever,
yeah.
and this woman is trying to give my mother grief stuff to go over her grieving, and
Yeah.
and my mother just said to her, "Oh no, he'll be great. He's a musician. He'll be great."
It was as always you were spirited off by aliens or something, right? Well, he's gone. Freddie's no longer with us.
Yeah,
So
I'm telling you, it really was like she was saying, "Sorry about Fred. Sorry he passed."
yeah, I want to go back. This is kind of strange here, but I'm going to fast forward backwards to chapter one, because you actually start off your book. Chapter one is titled Toronto, 1977, a watershed moment, I think, to say the least, in your career, and it gives people. It's a great chapter because it introduces you and what you've become, but it also gives people a real insight into how a record is produced. And most people have no idea what goes into a record being produced. So give me the story there.
Well, I didn't have an editor in the book per se. I had someone who did some editing, but they just wound up moving things so that the timelines were working. But otherwise, I was sort of on my own. So it's really a book written by me and frankly overseen by me. So that's the first thing I want to say. There's no ghostwriter. And frankly, the only thing the editor did, by the way, was tell me to get rid of 2 chapters. One chapter was about all the different pranks we pulled as kids in the studio. And she said, if you put this chapter in, people will hate you.
Why?
And so I took it out. And then there was another chapter called What I Like, What I Don't Like. And she said, this is the most arrogant chapter you'll ever imagine. She said, get rid of it, which I did.
Well, and I guess you risk pissing people off too, right?
Yeah, no, she just said, they're going to hate you, Fred. It's okay. So the bottom line is, going back to the first chapter, uh, Joel Selvin, who happened to be the husband of the woman who's my editor, and someone who really is a mentor to me, and one of the finest uh, pop and rock journalists and novelists and rock biographers in the world, Joel. He was really a great help to me. And he read the book in its earlier stage, and he said, Fred, you need to start the book with the Sometimes When We Touch chapter, because that's going to reel them in. And so originally it was not the first chapter, but now it is. And it's the story of basically how we, as kids, because I was 23 and Matt was 22, and my co-producer, and Dan Hill was
Matt
20.
being Matthew McCauley.
Matt McCauley, yeah. And Dan Hill was 22. And we were like the Three Musketeers, and we had done 2 albums with Dan as kids. We were just producing, but we were learning while we earned. And then the 3rd album was being recorded, and as it was, our U.S. label came out and said, we're going to drop you if you don't give us a hit finally in the U.S.
I think he described it by saying the pressure on Dan was like an anvil crashing down at his afro. Right? Am I right?
Yeah, I said it was like I don't remember. I think I said something. It was like an anvil on his afro or something.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I mean, the pressure was really,
no
really.
kidding.
But we were, you know what, Ted? We were kids, so Matt and I really didn't feel that much pressure. But Dan has his face on the album cover, so yeah, he felt more pressure than we did. So, they put a lot of pressure on us, but we were just kids, and Dan had never co-written before. And so his publisher in the US, because we had 2 successful albums and singles in Canada previous, and his publisher in the US said, why don't you come down to LA and co-write? And because, Dan can write great music and lyrics, but again, they were looking for a smash hit. So he said, please come down and co-write with some of our great writers. And Dan got the call that he's going to co-write with Barry Mann.
Wow.
And I, being sort of a musicologist without knowing it, I said, oh my God, Barry Mann. I said, that's the guy who wrote On Broadway.
Yeah.
He wrote You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin'.
With his wife.
With his wife, Cynthia Weil. But I mean, this is a guy who's written hits, 100 hits, including some of the biggest of all time. And so I said to Dan, this is heavy, man. This is fantastic. And Dan went down there, and I think he was very overwhelmed by writing with Barry. And by the end of the day, when they were trying to write together, they had nothing. And at the end of the day, Barry, who I've worked with, by the way, ever since, I still work with Barry at age whatever he is, 84. And Barry said to Dan at the end of the day when they couldn't write, he said, hey, man, he said, you know what, give me a lyric and I'll just put the music to it at home. And do you have anything around? And Dan grabbed a lyric out of his guitar case. And it was the lyrics for Sometimes When We Touch, which Dan had already written music to. And Matt and I had heard his version, which was a very plodding, dun, 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 sometimes, dun, 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 when we touch, dun, dun. Really, and we just said, okay, this is a good song, but it's going to be an album cut. So Dan gave Barry, without thinking about it, gave him the lyric to Sometimes When We Touch. Barry went home that night and wrote it quickly, sang it into a little boombox, and sent us the song as he put the music to. And we heard this cassette playing on our system when we got it in the studio. And we all looked at each other and said, "Oh my God, this is going to be a smash hit. This is like Elton John's Your Song."
Yeah.
Because Barry had put such gorgeous music behind Dan's lyrics. And right away, in those days, by the way, you could actually say, "I think this is a hit." And it really could have been a hit because there actually was situations that made it possible for something like this to have happened. It
Hmm.
doesn't happen anymore. It's gone. If you want a hit, it costs millions of dollars of investment and all sorts of stuff. It has nothing to do with what happened in our world. But back in the day, you could say, "Oh my God, this can be a hit," and it could have been. So we knew we had our best shot with this song. And it was very, very obvious to all of us that this was such a commercial, catchy, hooky song on every level and emotionally, lyrically, really good. And this is a long story, so I don't want to waste your entire interview telling you. But the bottom line is, you need to read the book because it's a big chapter. But it talks about how hard it was to
Yeah.
make this record,
Yeah.
and how Dan. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say it's fascinating. I mean, it's like a master class.
It can be, and again, if you look at the fact that we were working with technology that doesn't exist anymore, it was all analog technology. Like now, the digital domain would have made it much easier to make that record. It would have been
Mhm.
different, but it would have been easier to make, way easier. So with what we were up against and the pressure that Dan was under and the pressure that we were under as producers, um, a lot of the things went quite easily. And then when it got to the vocals, we really had a hard time. And I'd like people to read the book about the whole story. But, bottom line is, I think I say in the book, you always remember your first. And and for me, it was not only my first, but also the biggest hit I'll ever have. So yeah.
During the introduction, I mentioned related to you that you were a musician, composer, scorer of television and film. And so with that, I jumped to the year that you referred to as the best year ever, which was 1987. Happened to be the year that you and I first met. You and I ended up doing a television program. People can see this. Can they see that all right? Am I holding that up right?
Yeah.
A show called "It's Only Rock and Roll" on CBC, which was, I mean, it's the beginning of a great friendship to begin with. That's probably the most important thing. But we got to meet and see a lot of extremely talented people, and I recall Stevie Ray Vaughan jamming with in much. He was shocked. If you do you know what I'm talking about?
With Jeff Healey. Yeah.
He's playing with Jeff Healey for the first time. He's met Jeff Healey. Jeff Healey's a young kid at the time, and I remember watching and looking at Stevie Ray Vaughan, thinking like, "Holy cow, who is this kid?"
He's a blind genius guitar player who easily was Stevie Ray Vaughan's match.
Yeah, yeah. And then there was another kid who came along who had some pretty successful career following that. A guy that you actually, along with Joe Bodeli, the late Joe Bodeli, was one of the producers, and John Brunton was the executive producer, I guess, of the program at the time. He ran Insight Productions, who did it. Mike Myers, you found him at Second City because we were looking for character players to do some of the sketches. Do you recall that?
Yes, they went to Second City to find us. First of all, I want to say that, it was my favorite year of my life, and there were so many reasons why, but doing It's Only Rock and Roll with you was clearly one of the reasons why that year was so magical and so much fun. And I think sometimes, because a lot of it was dependent on you and then dependent on me a little bit more, than, let's say, a Paul Schaefer to a David Letterman.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think they wanted some extra comedy cast, a cast of others to help with some of the skits, etc.
Yeah.
And I do remember that they brought us a number of people who were definitely Second City people, young Second City teammates. And I'm pretty sure that we all had a say in the matter, but we saw Mike Myers audition and we said, "Oh my God, this kid's so full of energy and he's so funny." And he was a good looking young guy and he was just so funny. And So it was very obvious we would go with him as part of our cast.
And that program was the program that he introduced the character of Wayne from Wayne's World to the world.
And you and I both did actual skits with Mike,
Yes.
with Mike as Wayne,
Yes.
and we would be the straight man to Wayne.
I'll tell you a funny story. We used to have a small audience. We had an audience though for the taping, and here comes Mike Myers. He walks out in character as Wayne. And of course, he's wearing the wig and he's got his T-shirt, and he and I are doing our thing back and forth. And we finish. They go cut, and Mike gets up and he walks off the stage, and he takes off his wig, and a couple of guys in the front row went, "What?" They were shocked. They were like, "What? Wayne's isn't Wayne?" They thought he was this kid from Scarborough who was like, "Hey man, what are you doing?"
Yeah, well,
Oh, God, I
I'm
laughed
sure.
so hard.
I'm sure that Mike knew characters just like Wayne and created that character.
But that year was special for you, not just because of It's Only Rock and Roll, but at one point you were doing like 3 television shows. It's amazing.
I was scoring 3 different TV series and doing your show, and at the same time, my daughter was born that year, and yeah, it was pretty wild. But it happened to be just like every day was a holiday for me. It was fantastic.
I'm going to do something here because there are so many great stories in the book, and literally, and I jokingly said to you before we began this, I said we could turn this into 4 podcasts. So I've taken this one segment that I'm calling name dropping. These are the people that you've met and worked with. All of them are great stories. There's only one negative if we get to it, and you know who that is.
Yeah,
Let's
yeah,
talk first of all
yeah.
about someone who's. I guess you can't say enough about him. You refer to him as a tunesmith extraordinaire, that being Jimmy Webb, the man who is responsible for such great hits as MacArthur Park, Wichita Lineman, just to name a few. I mean, just a
By the
brilliant.
time I get to Phoenix,
Yeah.
Galveston, didn't we? Yeah, yeah.
And you produced an album with him, and have worked with him a number of times over the years.
I've worked with him all my adult life since I was 24.
Yeah. And what was it about him that you found to be? I mean, not only obviously the body of his work speaks for itself, but what was it about him, about Jimmy Webb the person, that really struck you, that really formed this bond?
Well, I didn't know Jimmy Webb the person. I knew his music, and I knew him as a singer-songwriter who was doing his own material. And his couple of albums he did in the early 70s did nothing, but I was a huge fan of how he interpreted his own material. And I just became a huge fan of his writing, and I loved his voice. I thought it was raw and great. And I saw that nothing was going on for him. He was not able to compete with the James Taylors and the Neil Youngs and the Joni Mitchells, but nevertheless, I think he was probably even more gifted than any of them. So when it came time, around the time we had the hit with Sometimes When We Touch, I actually reached out to a real Hollywood mogul kind of guy in 20th Century Fox, because he said to us at one point, hey, and he had a cigar. He goes, "Who do you want to produce next? I'm going to get him for you, And because at that point we were riding pretty high with this big hit of Sometimes When We
Sure.
Touch. And I could have said, Elton John. I could have said James Taylor. I could have said anybody who was brilliant and who sold records. And instead, I said to Harvey, I said, Jimmy Webb. And he looked at me the way you're looking at me. He looked at me and said, "Why?" And I said, because he's the greatest singer-songwriter that I can imagine. And I know he hasn't had any success yet. I know he doesn't have a record deal anymore, and I'd like to produce him. And Matt and I really want to produce him because we're just incredible fans of his writing and of his music.
Yeah.
And we wound up meeting him. We loved each other, and I've been working with Jimmy ever since. So as a person, we're just deep, close family, and we loved each other right from the beginning, and I'm still working with him.
But after what I've read, I take it you weren't adverse to just reaching out to people, because you at one point reached out to Michael McDonald, said, "Hey, would you consider maybe doing some background vocals for us?"
Well, I was a great listener and fan of records. Some people probably would say, I never listened to anybody else's records. Only concentrated on mine. But I was a huge fan of so many wonderful artists and so many records. And I heard Michael McDonald first on an album by Steely Dan called Katie Lied.
Yeah.
And I heard this background vocalist, and I loved the sound of his voice. And then I noticed he was now in the Doobie Brothers. And that album that had Taken It to the Streets on it was Michael doing his own material and singing lead for the first time. And I'm listening to it in Toronto going, oh my God, this guy is the greatest voice. And oh my God, the greatest writer. And I just happened to have a need for a background singer on a project we were doing for Randy Goodrum, who was a singer-songwriter signed to Arista. And we were going to be in LA doing some background vocals and some other overdubs. And I called Michael McDonald. I knew where he worked with the Doobies, and I just hoped he might be there. And by good fortune, he was there at the studio. And I said, hey, I'm Fred Mollin. I said, I produce records out of Toronto. And I produce Sometimes When We Touch by Dan Hill, blah, blah, blah. And I love your voice, and I would love to have you sing on this project that we're doing for Arista Records. And would you have any time, next month to do some background vocals? And he was like, oh, yeah, sure, whatever you want, man. I'd love to do it. It was just so off the cuff.
Yeah.
And again, he came and we did these background vocals at the record plant in LA. And I'm telling you, we levitated. It was the most exciting sessions to hear his voice on these records we did. And we, again, became family ever since then. Yeah.
Art Garfunkel.
Artie is such a character. I mean, he really is someone. Of course, growing up, I was a huge Simon and Garfunkel fan.
Yeah.
I think Paul Simon, along with Jimmy Webb and a few others, are probably the greatest songwriters in the history of song. And Garfunkel always had this incredibly beautiful voice. So I was a fan of both of them. And I was a fan of Artie's solo career. And I got to know Artie through Jimmy Webb because he had worked with Jimmy. And at one point, I was asked to meet with Artie in New York. And it was during my film and TV years. So I wasn't doing much record stuff because I was so busy in my TV and film life. But I wanted to do more records. And I remember getting a call from Jay Landers if I could fly down to New York and have a meeting with Artie to possibly be the producer for his new album. And this was probably I'm thinking 1989, maybe 86. And I flew down and we had this incredibly great meeting with Artie. And he really had a wonderful time with me. And I remember him saying, just all the right things. And we bonded. And I do remember, though, that Jay Landers and I walked him to the elevator when the meeting was over. Mm-hmm. And I remember that he looked at me and he said to me, and this is at the elevator, he said, Fred, it's been a fantastic meeting. And he said, we're really on the same wavelength. And then he said, but do I want someone on my wavelength? At that point, the elevator opened. He walked in, and I didn't see Artie for 7 more years.
Yeah, what a letdown. I mean, it's like I'm reading this and I'm thinking, oh, this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. No, you just had a dance with the best looking girl at the prom. And she said, I've never danced with someone who is so passionate as you. Good night. And then just walks away.
But I think it's even better. But do I want someone as passionate as you?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that's really quintessential art.
Ted Woloshyn returns in a moment.
I've had the great fortune to say that I've been associated with one of Toronto's finest names in men's clothing for more than 25 years. Tom's Place. Founded by Tom Mahalick's father in 1958, Tom's Place offers brand name men's apparel at unbeatable prices. But more than that, they boast a long-serving, knowledgeable, and friendly staff that can assist you whether you're looking for casual or formal attire. And they have plenty of first-class tailors on site. In addition, Tom and his family are well known for their philanthropic work. So if you're looking to deal with great people who can fulfill your clothing desires at outstanding prices, do yourself a favor and visit Tom's Place. They're open weekdays from 11 to 6, Saturdays 10 to 5, and Sundays noon to 5. You'll find Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. or check them out online at toms-place.com. Tom's Place will suit you.
Now back to Ted Woloshyn.
While we're on weird stories, let's talk about Brian Wilson. Because this one I had to read over 3 times. I went, wow.
Well, again, first of all, Brian Wilson, if anyone doesn't know, of course, the writer and linchpin of the Beach Boys, probably one of the greatest musical geniuses of our lifetime.
Mm.
And I've had lots of times where I'd be sort of talking to him a little bit here and there because my engineer would work with him. And Brian had a lot of drug issues, bad, in the 70s especially, and late 60s. And acid really unraveled him. And frankly, he had mental illness before, but his drug use absolutely made his mental illness far more of a problem.
Right.
And so Brian's career from the 70s on was just a terrible challenge. But his greatest work was really up until about in the early 70s. And then he was really sort of a mess. And he did a lot of solo albums. And my engineer in LA, Mark Lynette, recorded all of them. And we would wind up always passing because I'd be at Mark's studio and then Brian would come in after me or vice versa. And there was a great sort of almost autistic moment that I tell in my book, which is that I was sitting in Mark's home studio and I had just finished a session and Brian was going to be in next. And I was sitting there and I was on the phone at that point, getting ready to leave, but I decided I'd call my mom, and I was very close to my mom. And this must have been, again, probably I'm thinking maybe like 1993, maybe 1994.
Mm-hmm.
And I called my mom and I said, hey, I'm just letting you know I'm going to come pick you up at 7:00 and we're going to have dinner at so-and-so, whatever. And it was a very lovely little conversation. And because I was very close to my mom, and I hung up. And before I even had a chance to say goodbye to Brian, because again, I didn't know him, we would meet and we would say hello. And he always talked out of the side of his mouth in later years, almost like he had a stroke, but he didn't. And before I left, I must have been packing up or something. I saw him sort of lumber over, because he was quite overweight. He lumbered over to where I was on the phone after I'd gotten finished with my phone call. And he lumbered over there and he picked up the phone. And he said, and after he got to whoever it was on the phone, he said, yeah, yeah, it's Brian, yeah. Oh, I just wanted to say hello. Oh, okay, gotta go. Hanging up. Whatever. Mark's watching this. And he calls me later and he says, when you hung up the phone and Brian went over to the phone and made that phone call, he was calling his mother. And I'm like, yeah. And he said he hadn't spoke to his mother in 7 years. He hadn't spoken to her in 7 years. Wow. And the phone call was simply, hi, yeah, how you doing? Okay, gotta go. So it was a really autistic moment where he saw me and it was like monkey see, monkey do.
Yeah. And not to make fun of it. It's just like it's a peculiar.
Ted, he was damaged, and again, this is a musical genius like we've never seen, but again, he really had a true challenging mental illness, and that that's just an example of it. There's many Brian stories. I mean, my God, I could have written an entire 30-page chapter of stories I've heard, but that was one that happened to me.
Sir George Martin, talk about musical geniuses. The man responsible for the Beatles' success.
Yeah, Sir George Martin. Of course, he's the guy who was incredibly smart enough back in 1963 to sign the Beatles, who were just a scruffy bunch of guys. And he signed them, it turns out, over a dinner conversation I had with him. He told me he signed the Beatles because he thought it'd be fun making a record with them because they made him laugh.
He said he wasn't really a fan of their music? Is that
He
right?
didn't really see their music. He just said, you know what, this is a really fun bunch of Liverpool Scousers, And he said, I think I'll have fun making this record. And he didn't have any strong feelings about their music. And then he told me that when they did Hard Day's Night, the song Hard Day's Night, which had to be written the night before and recorded the next morning, when he saw that, he said he would never have, he would say, I will never have control over these guys again. I'll be following them as opposed to leading them. He had never seen exponential growth the way they grew from 63 till Hard Day's Night.
Well, and there was an interesting story about the film Hard Day's Night and the song, because sort of they both came at different times. It was Hard Day's Night was a song, and then it became the title of the film, or
No,
it's-
the title of the film was something else.
yeah,
And then last minute, Walter Shenson, who was the producer, called George Martin and said, you're going to have to get the boys to write a new song because we're calling the movie A Hard Day's Night, which was a Ringoism,
right.
He'd go, oh, it's been a hard day's night,
Right.
And so they decided to call the movie A Hard Day's Night last minute. And George told me he had to call John and Paul, and he said, can you guys write a new song called Hard Day's Night? And he told them why. And can you be in Abbey Road tomorrow morning? And we need to record it tomorrow morning. And literally what Sir George said to me was that what they brought him was this incredibly great rock song, and they had it down, and within 2 hours it was all done. And he just said, I'll be following these guys from now on. I'll never be able to be their producer again.
Yeah. Wow. You were fortunate to work with numerous artists simultaneously as they performed, doing duets. Billy Joel and Johnny Mathis, a duet.
Yeah, I was very fortunate by around 2010, I think, to produce an album called Mathis in Nashville,
Yeah.
which was a gorgeous record. I was so completely honored to produce Johnny Mathis. My God, that was, along with Sinatra and Tony Bennett, he's in that same pantheon. And so I had a ball working with John, and we loved each other. And it wound up, we did another album, which must have been his 7th Christmas album, called Sending You a Little Christmas. And I had the idea of asking Billy Joel, who I was a huge fan of, who actually came from my neck of the woods in
Right.
Long Island.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to get his email, probably through Jimmy Webb, I think. And I wrote to him directly and said, "Hey, buddy, blah blah blah." And didn't call him buddy, but I did say, we're doing an album with Johnny Mathis, and I had this vision of you doing a duet with him on the Christmas song, which is chestnuts roasting on an open fire.
Right.
And he wrote back right away and said, "I would love to do it. When are we doing it?" And he flew to Nashville, and we did the duet. And this is one of the rare times I've done duets where the actual two singers are together at the same time. And we did have Johnny and Billy in 2 separate isolation booths with the live band that I was conducting. And we did the Christmas song with Billy and Johnny live vocal. And at one point, John, who at that point must have been 80, I guess, or something, and Billy and Johnny could see each other in these 2 different isolation booths, and I could see them. And Johnny hit this high note on the modulation of Christmas song, and Billy, I'll take my glasses off. Billy looked at me and went like this. He went,
For those of you listening now, watching this, Fred just made this shocked look. It just came across
this
his
look
face.
of complete shock and awe.
Yeah.
It really was shock and awe that this guy could sing that high note so beautifully. And Billy rose to the occasion and did a gorgeous vocal with John. And if you want to hear that song, you should go on YouTube or whatever, or Spotify, and listen to the Christmas song with Billy Joel and Johnny Mathis.
You worked for a time with Dan Aykroyd?
Well, I never worked with Danny. We were just great friends, and we were friends back in the day. So I'm thinking probably 74,
Mm-hmm.
75, 76, 77, 78, right up until the time he went to New York and did Saturday Night Live. And then I would run into him occasionally.
Was he doing a kid show at the time for CBC, was he not?
Yes. So, the story in my book, which is a great story, and I won't go into details, but I always loved hanging with Danny and also people in the Second City group, because we had our own improvisational comedy group called Homemade Theater, which then turned into Homemade TV.
Yeah.
But we had the first improvisational group in Canada. And then Second City came in, and they were very well funded, and they had a liquor license and the whole 9 yards. So they sort of killed us. But we loved all the people in Second City. And this was the original group. So it was Danny Aykroyd and Gilda Radner and Eugene Levy and Joe Flaherty and Brian Doyle Murray. And they all became great friends of ours. And we weren't at all competitive because we loved them all. And I loved Danny. And I remember walking out of a place called The Bagel in Toronto. And this must have been around 1977 because it was before Saturday Night Live was on, so maybe 76. And Danny had been doing a TV series for CBC. He was on called Coming Up Rosie.
Right.
And it was a totally flaccid piece of dreck aimed really at young children, and young children would have been horrified.
Yeah.
It was just awful. We had a TV show on another day in the week for CBC called Homemade Television. And we were the most irreverent sort of Monty Python for kids show. And we were completely anarchists. So anyone who watched our show was basically just learning all the wrong things in the best way.
And they're putting, they're putting your show, because it's syndicated, and they're putting your show on at like the worst time possible.
Well, this is Homemade Television, and it ran nationally on CBC at the right time.
Okay.
That show ran at 4:30 in the afternoon wherever you were, or 5 o'clock in Newfoundland. That's always that half an hour thing. But anyway, we were doing a really fun show that was quite creative and cutting edge, and we wrote it. And Danny was doing a very scripted, really bland children's show. And he came to me when we saw each other outside of the Bagel and told me that he had this incredible offer to go to New York and be on this new series called Saturday Night, and that Lorne Michaels was going to hire him to be a writer, but that there was no guarantee he could be a performer. And then he said to me, and I said, well, that sounds incredible. And Danny said, yeah, Fred, he said, but the contract is so bad. And I said, well, how bad? Now, by this time, Ted, I'm already like a seasoned show business veteran, whatever, at 26 years old, 25 years old, because I've been through so much already. And Danny said, the contract is so bad, I don't want to sign it. And I said, well, how bad can it be? It's the big time. You're going to New York, NBC. And he goes, well, first of all, there's no guarantee in the contract that I'll ever perform on the show. He said, there's never a raise in my salary ever over 5 years. I can't do any other work except for this show.
Wow.
And I said, well, and this is where I felt like a little veteran of show business. I said, Dan, you're on Coming Up Rosie. It's a CBC really, really tame little kids show. And I said, this is the big time. And I said, if it goes really well, you can have your lawyer renegotiate a contract. And if it doesn't go well, there's no contract. They'll just let you go. So I said, you got to go for it, And so I'm not saying I'm the guy who made him make that decision.
No.
I know that my input had something to do with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Imagine though, a contract like that, it's you would think it's almost, not only is it almost, we know it's unfair, but it's bordering on illegal, would it not be today? I mean, you can't do anything. You can only eat between 5 and 6 o'clock and only wear green shirts. I mean, how silly was that?
There were no rules. It could be anything they wanted.
Watch this segue. What he needed at that time was a good lawyer, like, say, Alan Dershowitz. You're laughing because Alan Dershowitz is a friend of yours. This is what I love about this name dropping, because it's like, how do you go from Sir George Martin to Billy Joel and then Alan Dershowitz? Talk to me about Alan Dershowitz. And that was a difficult time being his friend, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it has been an interesting life. That's why I wrote the book.
Yeah.
Alan Dershowitz is one of the greatest legal minds of our generation. And I got to know him on Martha's Vineyard, which is where I spend my summers. And socially, I had an interesting social set. And Alan was one of them. We got along famously. So over the course of number of summers, we became great friends. And of course, we had nothing in common except that we were both Jews. It's about it. Otherwise, there was nothing in common. He was a lot older than me, and he was a fantastic, academic legal mind. And I'm just a musician. So it was fascinating to spend time with him, and still is. But I must say that um, the greatest, most interesting time with Alan was I would go to the beach with him every day during the O.J. Simpson trial.
Of course, Alan Dershowitz, for those of you not knowing, was part of the OJ's dream team of 8 or 9 lawyers or whatever he had at the
Yes,
time.
he was going to be on the appeals team, and he was part of that team to defend OJ. And I would hang with him every day, and we would watch the trial on TV every day together. And that was absolutely fascinating.
But
And I learned
what's
so
going on
much.
through your mind at the time? You think to yourself, okay, I'm hanging with this guy who's going to defend this guy in case he loses, and you're thinking in the back of your mind, OJ did it. Is that what you're thinking?
Oh, God, yeah. Oh,
All
God,
right.
yeah, yeah. But Alan explained to me very early on that the job of a defense lawyer is to never ask your client if he's guilty, and to simply decide if you want to defend this person. And if you do, you never ask that question, and you do everything you can to defend his rights and defend him.
Did you ever ask him if he thought OJ did it?
No,
Did you want to?
no. Oh, yeah. I mean, and he wouldn't have told me anyway. I mean,
No,
it's
of
not.
course not.
I mean, his job really was to defend him, and it. Listen, the Vineyard is a very liberal place. Martha's Vineyard is
Yeah, yeah.
a liberal bastion. So many of his friends did not like the fact that he was defending O.J. Simpson. And then, unfortunately, years later, he was actually one of the key lawyers to help Donald Trump not be impeached.
Yeah, and I'm sure that went over even bigger.
That you know what? That sadly, that was the end of Alan's social life on Martha's Vineyard.
And was that the end of your relationship with Alan?
I see him every summer. I run into him, and I always give him a hug and tell him I love him. But we don't hang. No.
Speaking of hanging, I'm the master of segues, and you watch this one. You'll love this one, Freddie.
You're doing good.
You'll
You're
love
doing
this one, Freddie. Ronnie Hawkins called you to. Ronnie Hawkins is one of the funniest guys. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us, but one of the funniest guys you'd ever meet. Ronnie Hawkins is recording an album. You're producing an album. It's in Toronto at the time. If I'm painting the picture wrong, tell me that I am. A friend of his, Bo Diddley, the legendary Bo Diddley, is in town performing somewhere, and he starts talking about Bo Diddley. And Bo Diddley was a gifted man, south of the border, if you know what I'm saying. Bo Diddley was well endowed, to say the least. But and I want you to tell me exactly how Ronnie Hawkins described Bo Diddley's gift. Go ahead.
Clearly, we're not on network television
we're
right
not.
now.
No, we're not. Go
and
ahead.
we're not on the
No.
we're not doing the children's hour.
No, we're not. No, we're not.
Ronnie was, I guess the world would be, he was naughty, Ronnie. He
Yes.
told these fantastic stories, which left us all just laughing so hard we'd be crying. And when he started talking about Bo Diddley, I mean, these stories were hair-raising and hysterical. But he said to me one day, and Ronnie, I'm not going to do Ronnie's Southern accent, although I probably could. But Ronnie said to me that Bo Diddley had more meat in his pants than A&P had in their freezers. And it only gets worse from there.
No, it gets better. It gets better. We're going to end the show on this one. I don't mean the career of the show.
I mean, you might end your career on this one.
No. This is you're just, you know what it is. You're just quoting. It's in context.
I am just quoting. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And these are quotes like. I mean, what I'm saying to you, those are his exact words.
And if that wasn't enough of a compliment, what else did he have to say about Bo Diddley's Diddley?
Well, I think one of the greater stories is that Bo Diddley was one of the early rock and roll black entertainers. Fantastic talent, but very much an outlaw. And he would dress really outlandishly in the 50s. And he looked sort of sinister, even though he wore glasses. He looked sort of sinister and would dress really wildly. And when he had his first couple of hits, he made some money. And Ronnie told me the story about him, about Bo Diddley going into a Cadillac dealership in Chicago in 1959. And, obviously different time back in the day. And he was looking at the new Cadillacs. And a very uptight white salesman came up to him and said, excuse me, sir. And again, this is a very outlandish black man looking at the Cadillacs. And the white guy goes up to Bo and he says, excuse me, sir, are you thinking of buying that Cadillac? And Bo looked at him and said, well, I'm thinking about pussy, but I'm going to buy the Cadillac.
And there's one more.
You're really going to push me on this. All right. Well, no one's going to buy the book now because we're telling the best story in the book.
There's 400 pages of great stories in there.
All right. Okay. So you're talking about the this is really a strange one.
Well, yeah, I think.
Again, Bo was Ronnie would joke and say, well, Fred, he's not like us regular cock boys, and he said, but don't worry, Fred, his is so big it never gets hard. And I said, well, that's great. Thank you for sharing. And, don't forget, I was still like, 29 years old, 30 years old. And so he said, Fred, there was one time that Bo was he was getting intimate with someone after the show. And as he was inserting, the woman said to him after a while, she said, oh, Bo, is it all in? And Bo said, yeah, everything's in except the tip.
And then he said, here's my favorite. He said, Bo's thing is so big, it's got its own liver.
And actually, he said Bo's cock is so big, it has its own ribs and liver.
There you go. You want more? Pick up the book.
If you want more, you're going to have to read the book. There's some salacious stuff in there. Yeah.
I just broke something, but don't worry about it. This is the book, okay? If you can see it, it's called Unplugged. It's available anywhere you find books. You can order it from Amazon. Go to your...
Or actually, Ted, you can go to fredmollinunplugged.com. fredmollinunplugged.com is a website, and they'll send me the books, and I will autograph them. So, yeah.
Mine is autographed.
Yours is inscribed.
It is.
Yeah.
But not by you. Well, however.
By a chimpanzee I hired.
Freddie, it's a real pleasure chatting with you again. Again, I love the book. It's a great read. It's looking for something to take to the cottage this summer, or anywhere you're going, any time of the year. I swear, pick it up. You will enjoy it, and you will learn so much from it. I mean, and if you have any interest at all in the recording aspect of the industry, you will learn a whole whack of stuff. I appreciate you spending the time with me, and it's great to see you, my friend.
Great to be on your show, and great to see you.
Right. That'll do it for another episode. Don't forget, tune in again. We'll be back next week. And in the meantime, check out our website, www.tedwoloshyn.ca, for all our past episodes. And while you're online, fill out your organ and tissue donation card. You could change or even save a life. In the meantime, have a great week.
The Ted Woloshyn podcast has been brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. And ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. Technical production by Paul Gadd. Music by Bike Thieves. For more on this podcast and our sponsors, and to talk to Ted, go to www.tedwoloshyn.ca.